Great.
Thank you, Aaron, for that excellent introduction. Hopefully this may be our last virtual assembly. We shall see. It was always fun to gather together in the first couple of weeks of December. I'd like to thank you and Samantha, our president, Finley, for and the whole council, frankly, for putting this together. I did it once it had to be over 10 years ago, and it's difficult when you're actually assembling, and I can imagine doing it online is quite a task. Today's panel, the 2021 recall election in California, I think is going to be especially interesting. I work in Colorado, but it was very big news in Colorado. I followed it closely. I blogged on it, and I had a lot of people with a high level of interest on it. Actually, my first experience with, and I didn't get a chance to ask our presenters, but my first experience with PAPOR was in '03. We had a conference in Los Angeles, which I think may be the only one we've had in Los Angeles. In any event, it was on the recall. It was right after the Schwarzenegger recall. It's possible that Mark and Mark presented, I don't know, but in any event, it was my introduction, and it just said to me that, wow, PAPOR is really doing things that are in the news. They're able to comment on real politics and real public policy, and I thought that was special. The abstract that our presenters put in pointed out that this had unusual media attention, very intense, so both local and I can tell you national, and obviously Colorado. They also pointed out, and I blogged on it a couple of times, there was an incredible number of polling organizations that were following it. And I was aware of those that were published. So that we have a very rich data field today to work with. We also have two of the longest serving statewide pollsters with this race. They both did more than one, I think a couple, maybe three or more statewide polls during the race. And they happen to have the final, as best I could tell, closest numbers to what the final result was, the 62, I guess, for and against, and which I think is a very good sign that the data that they're going to present, particularly those last polls, represent really what's going on among the demographics. Both of them are friends of mine. They're both friends of PAPOR. They've presented an incredible number of times. The first presenter is Mark DiCamillo, who now polls for the Berkeley Institute of Government Studies, IGS. Most of you know him as the polls to field pollster for many years, and retired as the director when it was sold and ended in 2016. So he has a wealth of experience to draw on. It makes all of his work extra interesting. IGS also devised a sort of creative polling methodology that I hadn't seen before, although we'd used little pieces of it. The idea of using the voter list is something that people have done, but it was extremely creative, I thought, and it proved, I've seen it, his use of it since 2018, and he may talk about this, but it had excellent accuracy then and since. And the thing that I notice is that it has excellent accuracy down to smaller jurisdictions. And of course, newspapers love that. And so consequently, I think one of the reasons why they have a partnership with the LA Times is that you love to look at congressional districts and obviously LA County, for example. So that'll be, that's great. And I think it's it's turning out to be something, given that it doesn't use phones, it's something I think we're all going to be interested in. Mark will be followed by Mark Baldassare, who I've also known for many years and is known well to PAPOR audiences and to Californians in general, because he's the president and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California, and has directed their statewide poll since the early 2000s and maybe the late 90s, but for a very long time. A frequent author, including, I noticed one, I think, on the recall back in 07 on the first recall, and also in 98, when he was just leaving, because he was at the University of California at Irvine, he did one on the bankruptcy of Orange County, which I thought was an interesting point to start. PPIC is sort of my place to go if I'm interested in a quick rundown of California public opinion and also public policy. And I think there's no doubt they help shape a lot of public policy in this state. Mark DiCamillo will start. He'll talk for 15 minutes. Then Mark Baldassare. Then we'll open for questions and discussion. So with that, Mark, let's begin. Mark D.
Thanks, Floyd. Pleasure to be here at PAPOR again. First, 2021 was supposed to be a relatively quiet year at the Berkeley IGS poll. It was sandwiched between the polls that we conducted in the very contentious 2020 presidential elections and next year's statewide elections. And I was looking forward to the slower pace of an off-election year. But all that changed once an somewhat obscure effort to recall Governor Gray Davis succeeded in gathering enough signatures by the spring of this year to qualify a statewide recall election, and that was eventually held on September 14th. That set in motion what now seems like a whirlwind of events, compressed into a relatively short 4-month period, as the recall captured the attention of not only political observers in California, but as Floyd said, across the nation. And, the election would eventually bring to California a huge array of polling organizations to assess voter assessments in the yes/no vote on the recall, and also about the campaign to replace the governor should the recall have actually succeeded. I counted over 20 different polls released during this time frame by over 15 different polling organizations, and I may not have captured them all. Okay, now having now had the benefit of several months to look back on the period, I feel that our polls actually performed quite well and accurately reflected voter sentiments at the two very different moments in time in the recall campaign. So what I'd like to do today, during the period that I have, the 15 minutes I have, I'd like to just review the performance of our poll, or just show the results, but also, because this is PAPOR, talk a little about how Berkeley goes about doing its statewide polls, since the methodology is rather unique and maybe not familiar to that many people. So with that, let me start with my presentation, if I can open it up. Hopefully, can you all see it now? I'll assume that's a yes.
Yep.
Great.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, first about the poll. The auspices of the poll, we're at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies. We do receive funding for our election polls from the Los Angeles Times. That's true for the recall and will be true for the coming year on the statewide elections. The data collection for us was, we did 2 polls of likely voters. One was completed in late July, the other that was completed in early September, about a week before the election. The poll itself is a self-administered poll online. We distribute email invitations to stratified random samples of registered voters drawn from the state's voter rolls. Each email invites voters to participate in a nonpartisan survey conducted by the university, and it's provided with a link to the website where the survey is housed. As Floyd said, we draw our samples off of the registered voter rolls, and those samples are provided to us by Political Data Incorporated. They're the state's leading voter list provider, and I recommend their work highly. The samples are drawn from the nearly 10 million voters on the California voter rolls who have an email address appended to their voter registration record, and that goes up every year. Since I last presented, I think the last presentation I had, there were 6 or 7 million voters with an email address. Now there's 10. The records also provide us with other information about the voter that we don't necessarily have to ask for in the survey: their age, their gender, their party registration, their county of residence, the preferred language, and their actual history of voting in past California elections. The sample sizes of the 2 likely voter polls: first, it started out in late July with nearly 6,000 registered voters, of whom about 2,700 were considered likely to vote at the time. We increased it for our final pre-election poll to almost 10,000, with about 6,500 likely voters. The survey was done in English and Spanish. Likely voters were defined in exactly the same way in both polls, it's important to remember, based on their voter testimony about their interest in and likelihood of voting in the recall election, and also after reviewing their history of voting in past elections. The test, in addition, the late September poll, or the early September poll, since it was done during the voting period, we actually verified that the people in our September poll who said they had already voted had actually turned in their ballots by looking at their voting records to see that their ballot had been received by local county registrars as of Monday, September 7, after the poll was done. We also add post-stratification weights, which are very important. They're applied to the registered voter samples using the population-based characteristics of the state's registered voters. And because the poll sample sizes are so large, the weights are applied not only, these are very detailed weights, and I'm glad for the university's help on these things, but they're done not only at the statewide level, but within major regions of the state on a number of variables. Okay, what did we find in our 2 likely voter polls? The first slide compares the results from first the late July poll to the early September poll, and you can see they were quite different. The results from our late July poll actually caused quite a stir, since the closeness of the preferences at the time took many by surprise. But a number of other prominent polls completed at roughly the same time found the same thing. And I'm particularly point out that the CBS News poll in California and the Public Opinion Strategies poll had about the same time, had a 4-point no side advantage. Also, an Emerson College poll done at about the same time had it only at 2 points on the no side. So there was company for our early poll. However, by early September, the tide had turned decisively against the recall, with the no side opening up a commanding 22-point lead in our final poll, and that ended up being fairly close to the election outcome. One of the reasons, actually the main reason, for the difference in the findings between the 2 polls had to do with the fact that the characteristics of likely voters in the 2 polls differed significantly. Really was more that than the any major shifts in voting preferences for the governor or about the recall. In late July, there was relatively low interest in voting expressed by Democrats and no party preference voters, as you can see on the left side of the graph, whereas Republicans expressed very high interest. The low level of Democratic interest coupled with that high level of Republican interest reduced the 22-point registration advantage that Democrats have in California to just 9 points in our likely voter sample in late July. This significantly changed by the time we did our final pre-election poll 1 week before the election in early September. Democratic interest spiked by 22 points up to 80%. No party preference voters interest spiked up to 70%. Republican interest remained very high, but that actually restored the Democratic advantage over Republicans and our likely voter sample in the early September poll to 19 points, which is, I would say, a pretty traditional turnout Republicans or Democrats to Republicans in a statewide election. This is my favorite slide. It basically shows on the left the actual outcome of the vote as reported by the Secretary of State, not only statewide, but across the 9 regions of the state that we track in our polls. And as you can see on the right, our poll, our final pre-election poll, stacked up pretty well on just about every measure. Statewide measure was very close. Our yes side support was at 38.5 and ended at 38.1. You can see the strongest levels of voter support were among voters in Los Angeles County and the San Francisco Bay Area. Our poll demonstrated that as well. And there were 3 parts of the state, 3 regions, where voting on the yes side either exceeded or equaled the proportion of no voters, and those were in the Inland Empire region, which is to the east of Los Angeles County, the Sacramento Valley, which is the southern part of the Central Valley, and the very sparsely populated North Coast Sierra region north of San Francisco and Sacramento. Our poll actually reflected that pretty well as well. One thing that really struck me about our poll was the wide differences in voter preferences that related to how a voter chose to cast their vote. If you look at those who said they voted by mail or had already voted by mail, the no vote was greater than 2 to 1. If you looked at those who said they voted by dropping off their ballot in a drop box or at another location before the election, also very strong no voting. But anybody who chose to vote either in person at their precinct or just brought their ballot in to the polls on election day, it was decidedly on the yes side. And that's an interesting finding to me. I'd never seen that before in our polls. This slide kind of summarizes the segments of the voting public that were most supportive of Newsom and voting no on the recall. And as you can see, almost all liberals, self-identified liberals, those who said they voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and registered Democrats said they voted no on the recall in our final poll. One interesting point to make is that we found a big difference between the voters, the Latino voters, who did the survey in Spanish compared to those who did it in English. And we had a fairly large sample of Spanish respondents, over 300, and 87% of them said they were voting no on the recall. Among the English dominant Latinos, which were 3 times as many, 60% said they were voting no. So Latinos were against the recall, but certainly the Spanish speakers much more so. They were also, there was also high levels of support among ethnic populations in California. The African Americans and Asians, over 70%, nearly 3 out of 4 chose to vote no. Okay, this slide then transitions to the replacement election and actually reports the results of from the Secretary of State's office. This is not from a poll. This is actually the number of people who participated in the recall, which was nearly 13 million, and 43% of those on the left side of the graph didn't actually cast a ballot in the replacement election. That's astounding to me. They chose not to just leave it blank, and it was mainly because the Newsom campaign basically was telling voters, its supporters anyways, to vote no on the recall and to just leave that replacement election ballot blank, and many of them obviously did. Those who did vote in the gubernatorial replacement election were overwhelmingly for Larry Elder. He received 48% of the vote. None of the other, and there were 46 candidates on the ballot, none of the other candidates got into the double digits. Here's how the polling of the Berkeley IGS poll reported in the replacement election. Again, our 2 polls in late July and early September, comparing it to the election outcome in black. In late July, Elder had just entered the race, and he was still the leader. He was the early leader at 18%, but the race was not all that one-sided at that point. However, in early September, he opened up a huge lead with none of the other candidates in double digits. In fact, there was a Democrat actually who got to 10% in that poll, but that was as high as anyone got. And Elder ultimately got to 48.5% in the election. one thing that we were able to do in the replacement election on a technical side is that since this was a self-administered poll, we were able to display all the names of all 46 candidates on the ballot, along with their job titles and their party, as voters would see when they go to the polls. It wasn't a truncated list of just the better known candidates. It's a real advantage of doing a self-administered poll. One other thing that we did include in our poll were statements, agree, disagree statements. We included 10 of them in our final poll, and these are the 4 that received the highest levels of agreement by recall election voters. If a conservative Republican were to become governor as a result of the recall, it would threaten many of the state's well-established policies on issues like climate change, immigration, healthcare, and abortion. Greater than 2-to-1 agreement on that. And as you can see, big differences between no and yes voters on the recall, not only on this one, but on all of them. The cost of holding the recall election was perceived as a waste of taxpayer money by 61%. Newsom kind of did himself some damage. As you can see on this statement, the third one down, through his own actions, Newsom demonstrated that the strict policies and behaviors that he wants others to follow during the pandemic don't apply to him. That mainly had to do with his attending that infamous French Laundry dinner without a mask. And then the recall election was seen as undemocratic because with so many people running, if Newsom is recalled, a new California governor could be elected with only a small share of the vote. Those concludes my slides, but I have 3 major takeaways if I still have the time. The first is my view that the recall election was largely about motivating Democratic voters and also independent voters to take the election seriously and turn out to vote. Over the short 8-week period between our 2 polls, the Newsom campaign did a masterful job in achieving that. And this was demonstrated not only by voters' strong rejection of the recall, but also by his campaign's ability to get voters to abstain from voting in the recall election, or the replacement election. Second takeaway was that there's a long-standing impact of the Trump campaign's efforts to discourage Republicans to vote by mail, as you could see by the differences in voting preferences between those who had voted by mail and those who went to the polls, with Republicans now in California largely just casting their ballot on election day. And finally, I would say that pre-election polling isn't quite dead yet. I've read a few commentators proclaiming that, but I think polling here in the California recall, both by our poll and by Mark's poll, demonstrate that pre-election polls can be an accurate reflection of what voters are likely to do in an upcoming election cycle. There you go. That's my presentation, and thank you very much.
Very good, Mark. I don't know how many questions we have, but I just listening to it and walking through the data, a couple of interesting questions come out. But let's go now to Mark Baldassare and have his presentation.
Thank you, Floyd. And as always, it's great to see you, and always appreciate your perspective coming from Colorado, which has a number of things in common with California in terms of our direct democracy system. I don't think that you've tested the recall effort on the gubernatorial front yet, and I'm not sure where that is, but certainly on initiatives, we always have something to compare and contrast. So appreciate your leadership and your willingness to take this on.
Thank you. It's so true. And one of these days, we probably will have a gubernatorial recall. We have people have tried.
Yeah, yeah. And people have certainly tried a lot of times here. In fact, in the state of California, over 50 times there have been efforts to recall the governor. Most of them have failed, except for 2 efforts that have made it to the ballot. And now the batting average is 500 for recall efforts. But let me go to the slides and appreciated hearing from Mark and the work of IGS during this, and wanted to share with you some of our findings on the recall effort. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So first of all, Floyd mentioned that we did polling during the 2003 recall. So as soon as I heard that there was going to be a recall, of course, the first thing I did was I took the book off the shelf that I had written in 2007 and started, thumbing through the pages about how does the recall work. And then I went to our statewide surveys in 2003 for kind of a frame of reference in terms of how did we actually go about doing the polling. But to me, this is one of the most important things that I want to show you about the difference between 2003 and 2021. And there are two factors that are very important that have changed over time in California. One is we now have automatic voter registration. So you'll see that our population grew by 3 million, which by California standards is slow growth. But the number of registered voters in the state between 2003 and 2021 increased dramatically by 6.7 million because it's relatively easy for people to register to vote. So now we're in a situation where 89% of the eligible adults in California are registered to vote. That's compared to 70%. So that's a very high number. Still, there are millions of people who aren't registered to vote because they're not eligible or they haven't yet, but that is a relatively high number. When we went into this election in a non-election year, particularly because it was clear that there wasn't going to be an Arnold Schwarzenegger on the ballot, on the replacement ballot. There were a lot of questions about what the turnout would be, but I think it's two factors led to the higher than 2003 turnout among eligible adults and the strong turnout among registered to vote voters, those who are registered to vote. One was, as I mentioned, automatic voter registration, but the other was a practice which had started during the pandemic in 2020 and was continued in 2021 and will be going forward. The path that we will see in California, and that is vote by mail, in which everyone is sent a ballot. And as I thought about that context for this election, that gave me pause for when it was that we wanted to be in the field, and particularly with our last survey, when would voters be getting that, every voter be getting that ballot in the mail, and all of a sudden they'd be getting, turning their attention to that, and that was right around mid-August that the ballots were mailed. But last but not least, I just want to mention that the partisan makeup of California changed from a 10-point gap between Democrats and Republicans to a 20-point gap between Democrats and Republicans. And that number sort of guided my thinking about what this recall political context was like, because we have seen in all of our statewide polling over the course of the last 5 years that partisans are deeply divided, and if you're a Republican, particularly during the Trump era, we saw very little movement in attitudes towards President Trump, in approval of President Trump. In our polling, consistently, we've seen a deep divide between Democrats and Republicans on Governor Newsom, and one that in our polling didn't change over time. But that context, to me, is just really important to set the framework for the polling that took place. So we were in the field with a survey in January, but we decided that at that point it seemed likely that there'd be a recall, but it was really in our March survey that we started measuring the recall. Again, looking back to what we did in 2003, then in our May survey, and then we picked it up again in August after the ballots were mailed. People had up to September 14th to either mail back their ballot or go in to vote. We use the methodology that we use in all of our election polling, which is guided by what we look at in terms of our national peers, what methodology they're using, which is random digit dialing of all adults. And we're using 75% cell phone, 25% landline in English and Spanish. A word about the definitions of likely voters, which again, in this context, we decided we weren't going to do anything differently in this special election year than what we did in 2020 or 2018 or any other election year. And that is for our polling, which is far further removed from the election date. We're asking a series of screening questions of those people who've told us they're registered voters. Specifically, have they voted in the past and their level of political interest to determine who the likely voters are. And then when we get close to election, and that's usually certainly always our last poll, as this one was, but sometimes 2 months before as well, when it's close to the election, we will add 2 questions, one on people's intention to vote, and one on the degree to which they are following election news. So those 2 additional screening questions were asked in our survey that was conducted in late August. As you'll note in our polling, we saw virtually no change in attitudes towards the recall between our March, May, and September surveys. All roughly 40%, and the final election results 38 to 62, which the most important thing to remember about that 38 to 62 is that Governor Newsom won the 2018 election 62 to 38, which I think gives you another clear signal about the degree to which our state, like the country, is highly polarized. These were the results in our by party in our final election poll, which we saw in all 3 of the polls, in which we would continue to see in any kind of question we asked about Governor Newsom, which is Democrats highly supportive, Republicans highly supportive of the recall, not Governor Newsom, and independents, most of whom leaning or Democratic leaning in the state by about a 10-point margin, giving mixed reviews. But of course, this to me was, and by the way, you can look at our cross steps and methodology in more detail. It's all on our website, and that's referenced here. But this to me was a key question we asked in September, which we didn't actually ask in the earlier time periods, because again, I was interested in when people have the ballot in their hand or in their mailbox, how are they thinking about this election? And this was these findings really critical in terms of the notion that that people who want to remove Governor Newsom somehow, more engaged than others. No, there were an equal number of people who said they wanted to vote to remove and wanted to keep Newsom, saying that this election was very important. 3/4 of Democrats said the outcome of the vote is very important. And that number, actually slightly higher than among Republicans. So that, indicated that this was an election, a governor's recall at the end of the day that got people's attention, and they went out and voted on it. this was a different kind of question that we asked because, there was a lot of discussion, particularly during the summer months, about how the fact that, Republicans and those who wanted to remove Newsom were more enthusiastic about the election, and therefore they might be more likely to go out to vote. Well, yeah, they were more enthusiastic about the election, and I wrote about this to some extent and afterwards. And there's a reason why Republicans and those who supported the removal of Newsom were when they were asked in a poll, yeah, we're more enthusiastic because keep in mind that Republicans have not won a statewide election, a candidate election, since 2006. So yeah, this is a time when Republicans and those who were voting to remove Newsom thought, wow, this might be different. So that comes out in the enthusiasm, but it doesn't come out in the extent to which people thought, hey, the outcome is important, I've got to go and vote, which is a different type of motivation. This gives you among from all of our California polls since Governor Newsom was elected, a look at what his approval ratings have been in our, and this is his overall approval. We ask about his approval on specific issues, the economy, schools, environment, but this is his overall approval rating, which, as we noted in our, well, actually in a write-up that I had in January before the recall had qualified, that Governor Newsom's ratings during the time of the pandemic, let's say starting around, in early 2020, have been, they've been in positive territory the whole time, and they remained in positive territory throughout the time of the year in which, there was either ballots started being collected and there was talk of a recall. He was in positive territory, down from the peak approval rating that he had in when the pandemic started. Very typical that we saw nationwide for governors, but not to be mistaken with being in the kind of negative territory that Gray Davis was in. And this isn't the approval rating, but this is the right direction, wrong direction number, just to give you a sense of the difference between the election after the recall election in 2003 and right direction, wrong direction, and which was in the low 20s as compared to during the recall of Newsom, twice as high. Mixed ratings with right direction, wrong direction, obviously in the context of the pandemic and the economic issues that California is facing and other issues, climate change and so forth, but still a world of a difference from 2003. And these were the top issues that were on people's minds. And if you look at the exit polls, you'll see, similarly that COVID was a big issue in all of our polling. Newsom's ratings on COVID were in positive territory, and also Newsom's ratings on jobs and the economy in July were in positive territory. So these were the top issues. So in conclusion, where I started out with and where I ended up with this analysis, very different context of the 2021 recall and the 2003, with obviously a very different outcome, very similar results to the 2018 election, indicative of the degree to which we have polarization and hyperpartisanship in responses to political issues and politicians today. Governor's recalls are very important to voters, and they, I think, proved once again in terms of the turnout how important it is. In the context of mixed reviews on the state of the state, Californian state with the leader that they had. But last and not least, I really want to emphasize the fact that what was unique about this recall was that COVID was the top issue when people went to vote, and the recall itself was born and it evolved through the course of the COVID crisis. And by that I mean, in particular, while many people had referenced the events in November of the French Laundry controversy with as what launched the recall, what really launched the recall and made it possible that I agree took place in November was a different event, and that was the courts allowing the signature gatherers to take extra months to gather signature, which made all the difference in the world. It made the difference between a recall like many others that had started that would not have had enough signatures, to one that had a significant amount of time to collect the signatures that were needed to make the recall ballot possible. And with that significant amount of time, significant money came in and made the recall, made it possible for the recall to reach the ballot. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, the vote by mail, which was instituted because of COVID, that everybody got to vote by mail, made all the difference in terms of what the potential turnout was going to be for this election, and one that obviously favored the incumbent or the current governor. And thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. If we have some questions from the audience, please put those in the chat, and Samantha or Aaron will let us know. I have a couple just on sampling. Mark DiCamillo, I know you get a lot of questions on this. As Baldassare pointed out, there's maybe 20 million voters, and you just cited that there are 10 million with email addresses. Is there a big difference between the two of them, and those two groups that you're polling with your direct mail piece, your first inquiry, and do you have to do weighing to try and correct that alignment, or talk about that for a second?
Sure. As more and more voters have email addresses, I think the problem will take care of itself. But I still think 10 million voters to sample from is pretty robust. And, we are stratifying the samples by age when we draw them. There are differences, and the biggest difference, if you looked at the demographics of who has an email address on their voting registration form and who doesn't, is age. So we basically try to take care of that in the stratification. But again, I'm not that uncomfortable sampling off of 10 million Californians. And also, I might add that of the 22 million voters who are supposedly on the voter registration rolls, it would be my guess, just based on history, that 10% of them are deadwood, that they're not really there. And those voters are probably much less likely to have an email address since they're not as current. And I would say that we probably have about half of the voters' email addresses. Still not as perfect as you'd like it to be, but I still feel pretty good about the method, especially the way it performed.
You also said, and 10 million is a big number. You also said that you weigh in post stratification to the sample to the state's registered voters population characteristics. In other words, you're looking at and you point out some of the things that are on the that are available to look at, including obviously age and a lot of other demographics. Is it your sense that I mean, obviously you want to have an alignment with the registered base, but on the other hand, you could be having a significantly different turnout emphasis coming out, some particular area of the state or some particular demographic group. Is that an issue that you have to think about when you're trying to apply weights based on what is currently the voter registration base?
Actually, no. We restrict all of the weighting to the voter registration sample. And that's why, we always start out asking everybody the demographics and all the key questions of the total registered voter sample, because that's where our population values come from. And to me, it's essential that you weight to known population values. The voter rolls gives you the added advantage of looking at who voted in past elections. That helps as well. But again, the age, the gender, the party registration, which, if you ask party registration on the phone, I would guess of people who are no party preference voters, many of them wouldn't report that correctly. It's a tough thing. I used to do that on the field poll all the time. But the voter rolls, we don't even ask party. It's there. And so we can weight by party. And that's a big issue in random digit dialing, whether you weight using party as a thing, because usually it's party identification and that varies from poll to poll and who knows what you're getting. But we are holding constant the weights that we apply, and we keep refining them more and more as we go forward. And, as we go to the 2022 elections, I think I'm a little smarter than I was in 2021. And so, we'll learn more as we go along. I think we're getting better at this, certainly than we were 2 years ago.
Well, I'm going to be surprised if we don't see the approach adopted more broadly around the country. A lot of campaigns, as you well know, use the voter registration roll, but they have been up until maybe the last 2 to 4 years just doing phoning. And I think they're now starting to shift as much as possible to online, at least in terms of trying to identify people that will participate, and then following up to get the call through if they're still using phones. But I just sort of think that your approach is going to get more and more interest out there, because while Mark Baldassare is he's right that's still, we still keep saying that the gold standard is the random digit dialing off of using phones for the most part. That is a very expensive approach, and if you noticed in this latest round of after 2020 and the AAPOR report, et cetera, there's increasing dialogue about the value of panels and the value of I think what you're attempting to do. So I'll be very interested in watching 2024. I just think that the methodologies are really dispersing pretty dramatically at that point. So one final question from me, and either one of you, Mark Baldassare, did you have a response or a comment? No. One final question, and you both addressed it, and that is the fact that Mark, in your which you cite on one of your slides, that your first poll showed a closer race, and which you attributed to awareness, enthusiasm, interest, etc., and a gap that was closed by, as you pointed out, by a very brilliant campaign by the governor. Also, I think the increase in COVID concern played into it, and also Mr. Elders. It was sort of a feedback loop, negative for the Republicans, that every time Mr. Elders got more popular, and Newsom, of course, was attacking him more and more, it was actually helping Newsom, because more and more Democrats were saying, oh, there's a lot at risk here. There's something really going on here. But how do you And as you pointed out, there were several polls that said that it was close at that point. And that became the narrative for some time. Then, as you pointed out, sort of toward the end, everybody said, "Oh, we should have known all the time. This is a Democratic state. It was going to turn out Democratic," and there was some criticism. What's your sense of that? It seems to me that there was evidence that at one point, if the race wasn't necessarily close in terms of people's real choice, it was close in terms of whether or not they were going to participate. Is that your thought?
That's definitely it. And, all I can say about a poll, a well-conducted poll, should be an accurate reflection of what's going on at any one point in time. The late July poll indicated a lower turnout, a much lower turnout, and in fact, a heavily Republican turnout, at least in breaking down the registration advantage of Democrats from 22 points to 9 in that poll. So it frightened people that, look, if Democrats are going to continue to be asleep in this recall, they're in jeopardy. But, you can also take the view that, well, that's not likely to last. And I say, so be it. I'll measure the next time and we'll see if it's changed. That's all I can do as a pollster, is measure different points in time. You can be a predictor and say, well, this won't hold, and maybe you're going to be right, but that's not my job.
As you know, there was one poll that went completely over the edge, the USA Today poll, and I added it to one of my blogs, and a lot of my friends at UCLA who are poli-sci when I graduated, which was several decades ago, all told me, no way, Ciruli, that's not happening. And as you know, USA Today said that they had made I think wording mistake was one of the problems. And also it took a while to realize that the reason why that particular Democrat was getting so much play is that they had, that was the only one they put on their I think 7-person list that they asked people to pick. And if you were a Democrat, and he was the only Democrat, I think they picked a Democrat. I don't know. Did you follow? Were there some polls in your mind that were, as you point out, there were a lot of polls. You two were the best at the end. But was it your sense that there was some that led a false narrative because the press followed it so closely, or were weak methodology?
Mark,
can I quickly interject here? Because I want to keep us on track, and I don't want to cut off the Mark show because you guys are so excellent and such a great conversation. There's a couple of questions that are still in the Q&A, and we're going to head to break really soon. So I think in the next 4 minutes, if we can quickly, maybe some final comments, and then we would love to have the Mark show engage more on Whova, like answer the questions there. That would be so wonderful to do.
Because I didn't see him on my screen. Maybe it's because I'm in a
lot of tech going on. Don't worry about it.
You got it. Go ahead, Mark, and then quick, and then we'll go to what's on their screen.
I don't like criticizing or pointing out the flaws in other pollsters. I don't think there's any great value in that by me. I have my own opinions. I usually follow the pollsters, and I'm sure Mark does the same, who he has the most respect for. When Mark releases his polls, he always cites Pew. I think Pew does great polling. I would follow Pew in all their methodologies as well. In election polling, we kind of are blazing our own trail here, but I do have respect for the national network polls, not so much for Survey USA, unfortunately.
That's one reason why several years ago I started using trying to do a medley of them together, because I think that any one poll can be an outlier. Aaron, go ahead. Questions that you have.
Okay, so one question is, did you find that there's significant differences in party ID between Spanish and English dominant Latino respondents? Either of you, if you.
I don't have an answer on that, Mark.
You want me to answer that, Mark?
Yeah, I don't have an answer on that.
Oh, okay. Well, we don't actually ask party ID. We just follow their party registration.
Yeah.
And it is true that Spanish dominant Latinos are more likely to be registered as Democrats, less likely to be registered as Republicans. There's a big chunk who are no party preference voters, but tend to vote like Democrats. I mean,
Yeah.
that's where, I think any pollster would like to follow up. If you're registered as no party preference, how do they usually vote, or, how do you lean? But certainly there's a difference. And, one of the reasons I think our polls, both PPIC and IGS, were probably more accurate at the end is that we do interviews in Spanish. We'd survey in Spanish. And if you didn't, you're going to miss some of that no vote, as our poll demonstrated. And I think quite a few of the national pollsters who came to California were only doing English language surveys.
And then did either of you use an incentive of any form?
No.
No?
Did,
And then I would just say, since for the sake of time, if you maybe have like a 1-minute wrap up remarks that would, before we head out to break, that would be ideal. Either Mark.
Mark B., why don't you take the stage? I've been answering too many of these.
Well, I would just say that it's a really important decision in special elections like the one we had in California to think about when you're going to be in the field. And that was something that, at the beginning of the year, we didn't plan our survey schedule around having a recall, and then we didn't know what the date was going to be. And we gave a lot of thought to, did we want to add an additional survey at an additional time? And so I think for others, because, I think it's likely that we're going to be in a period now, because we're in a hyper-partisan era, that there will be recalls, is to think about when you're going to be in the field in relation to what's going on in the environment when you have an election that isn't the first Tuesday in November. Yeah. So that's for the PAPOR audience. And thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent. Mark D.
Oh, not really. I agree with Mark. In fact, we waited to do that late July survey until the date of the election was announced. We knew in the late July survey that it would be coming on September 14th. So when we asked voters their likelihood of voting, we could reference in early September, we could reference a date. If it was unknown to us, I think we would have gotten less accurate information, but that was another reason for the timing of our first poll. And certainly we always poll in the final weeks.
Wonderful. We may have lost Floyd, unfortunately.
I'm back.
He froze. Oh, you're back. Great. I just can't see you in my view. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for the Mark Show. As